Hi, how is everyone? So Sophia commented that this looks rather formal, and I brushed off the regard, and now I'm sitting up here and it feels incredibly formal. I also have this rather nice card that both tells you who I am and me, in case I'd forgotten, which is always a distinct possibility. So there we are. So hello everybody, welcome to the launch of the book, The What Works Centres, which is very exciting. I'm very privileged insofar as I get to have my name on the cover of the book, despite having done next to no work on it, which is really the best thing to do. I can recommend editing very, very strongly. I haven't brought a copy of the book up here with me, which means I missed learning something from David Halpin in all the years I followed him around. He has always got a copy of his book on him. Possibly two. 2 books, 2 copies, who knows? So this is a book about the What Works Centres. I decided, working with Jonathan a few years ago, that this was a book I wanted to read, and since nobody else seemed like they were writing or editing it, we better get on with it and do it ourselves. The book itself is the product of a great many chapters written by a great many brilliant people who've poured their time, energy, and in many cases lots and lots of money into the What Works movement in order to try and improve outcomes for people across the country and indeed around the world. So it's been a real privilege to get to edit it. This evening we're going to have a very small series of very small talks followed by questions and answers, so you can get ready to ask us the most difficult questions you can in this chair. If they're really difficult, I'll get leisure to answer them. So I will introduce our speakers as we go forward, and our first speaker is going to be Stian Westlake, who is the Chief Executive of the Royal Statistical Society, and will have a different job soon, but I won't mention that.
Thank you so much, and it's great to see so many friends, supporters, participants in the various aspects of the What Works Centres and networks here tonight. I suppose I've always been passionate about the What Works Centres, partly out of my kind of own personal devotion to Michael Young, and I know there are kind of a fair few Michael Young fans here in various guises. Ligia and I were just talking, we worked at the Young Foundation for about 2 days at the same time. We overlapped by about 2 days in our time there. But I sort of feel there are 2 things about the Michael Young legacy that What Works Centres capture. The first was his kind of zeal for the importance of research and knowledge in addressing social problems. That kind of idea that rigorous research could be practically applied. I mean, that sort of is the lifeblood of everything that we do here, and I think really comes through strongly in the spirit of the excellent book. But I think the other element, that's a sort of very Michael Youngian element, is the passion for institution building. Because obviously the What Works Centres are not just research, there is lots of research out there. But they bring together, they give institutional form, both in themselves and through the networks to this spirit of using knowledge usefully. And I think that's part of the grand experiment. You know, we are still seeing how they work. There are so many questions around the intersections between the What Works Centres, how they tie into the networks. But often with these things, you can only find out how to make institutions work by trying them out. I thought it might be helpful just to sort of identify a few things that, from my perspective, I see as the kind of the next steps, the challenges that What Works Centres face, and building on the spirit of challenge put out in the books. The first of them is relates to what I've always thought of as the Burkes and Wankers theory of public policy. Some of you may know the writings of Kingsley Amis. Kingsley Amis used to talk about the way people wrote and criticised the English language. And he basically said there were 2 types of people when it came to writing. There were Burkes and there were Wankers. And Burkes are people who used language very inelegantly. They were kind of very sort of crude, and they made sort of malapropisms and that kind of thing. And Wankers are people who use language in too refined a way. Their writing was pretentious and euphuistic. And that if you were a writer, you had to chart a middle course between those 2 issues. And I've always thought when you're thinking about giving public policy advice, there's a very similar dichotomy. Because on the one hand, there is a really important wellspring of rigorous research, which sometimes is not directly applied to what policymakers need. So there is a challenge of how do you avoid that extreme. But on the other hand, as anyone who's involved with public policy will know, there's a lot of very bad and unevidenced advice that gets given to policymakers, and often that's very compelling, that bad advice. And I think part of what is attractive about What Works Centres is that they are an attempt to plot the middle course between Burkedom and wankerdom in that area. And I think obviously that is a challenge. I mean, I'm very aware of the criticism that, say, Tom Forth made of aspects of the What Works Centre for Local Economic Growth, about saying that, for example, some of the thresholds for evidence were too high. I think that's a very useful and creative and productive debate to have, working out, well, how specific do we need to be about interventions, where do we pitch our things, but this is something that we kind of work through as a movement. The second issue is what I would call the oven door problem, and I think this relates to any kind of institution building. If you're baking a cake, obviously the temptation is to open the oven door and see whether the cake's ready. I certainly do that. Cakes always seem to take longer to bake than I think they will, and if you do that too often, the cake doesn't rise. Obviously, this is a real challenge with institutions. I think this is sort of my track record as a funder. I'm sure others of you will recognise this, that there's always a challenge between how do you work out whether an institutional innovation, like a given What Works Centre, is working versus when it needs a little bit more time. I think that is always a challenge and something that comes out in the book. And then I think the last thing I want to mention, since we're here at King's College London, arguably the UK's home of political economy, I think there's an interesting challenge for What Works Centres about how to take into account the political economy, not just the kind of the economics and the social science of what works. I think when we look at public policy challenges across the board in the areas of What Works Centres, but in other areas, things like housing, for example, I think there are a number of areas where we have a fairly good idea what the answers are from a descriptive point of view. But the challenge is how to engineer the right deals, how to make the political economy deals so that things can get implemented. I think it's quite interesting if we look at some of the use of randomization, some of the use of rigorous evidence in development. That's actually something that I think the development world has done quite well. They've thought not just about the empirics and what works, but they've actually made some interesting inroads into the political economy of how you persuade people to get things done. So since we're at the UK's home of political economy, I thought I would put in a pitch for a political economy as part of the future of What Works Centres. But this is a fantastic movement we're part of. I think being here at the kind of close to the 10th anniversary is a good time to celebrate it. And what better way to celebrate it than with this fantastic new book? So thank you for writing it.
Thank you, sir. And we will now move smoothly to Alicia Tijera, who is the Chief Executive of the Centre for Homelessness Impact.
Thank you so much, Michael. And I thought I'd use my 5 minutes to explain why the What Works movement has become such a central part of my life, of my work, and of my philosophy. But before I do so, I want to tell you about how I first came to learn about the What Works network. At that point in my life, I'd been working for about 7 years in the third sector, and we were doing some fantastic work. I had the best job in the world, I always said, and I believed it. And I certainly didn't regret leaving the LSE to join the third sector. I still felt that I'd gone from talking and theorizing about the just or ideal society to working in the real world to improve the society that we live in. That was important to me. But after 7 years, I had to ask, what else could be done? Billions of pounds have been invested in different waves of policy reform in homelessness. The situation had improved since the 1960s, when homelessness entered the public consciousness as a problem. But decades on, we had to accept reality. While our best programs made a difference, they did not make enough of a difference. It was against that backdrop that while killing time at an airport one day, I spotted David Halpin's Inside the Nudge unit in a bookstore. In it, David talks about this new type of institution, the What Works Centre, how they can ensure that the best data and evidence is at the fingertips of policymakers, of practitioners, so they can make much better use of limited resources, so they can question received wisdom and act on the best knowledge available. David explains how at the heart of the What Works approach is humility, recognizing that there's limits to what can be understood through abstract reasoning and information gathering alone, that we need to test things empirically to find out what works. It was an eureka moment for me. It gave me hope. It inspired me. Progress in other social policy fields, such as international development, education, suggested that there might be a much smarter way to go about working towards a future without homelessness. So that's why in 2018, with the support of Crisis and the Homelessness Network Scotland and Humphrey Badcock's investment, I founded the Centre for Homelessness Impact, the 11th What Works Centre to be created. Since we launched the centre, the growth of reliable evidence available in the field, has been significant. From only 221 robust studies or reviews available worldwide 5 years ago to nearly 700 now, so an increase of over 300%. We've demonstrated that it's possible to conduct systematic reviews and randomized controlled trials in homelessness with thousands of people taking part in them. We've become a trusted partner of central government and the devolved administrations, and over 300 local areas have worked with us directly with CHI over the years as well. Really with a huge desire and keenness to apply data and evidence even better to their work, because they already do that, by the way. It's been great, but it certainly hasn't been easy. There are huge challenges, methodological barriers to answer the simple question, what works? I've certainly learned that the hard way the last 5 years. On occasion, you'll encounter resistance as well, though it seems that we've faced less resistance than most. And, obviously people often think that they already know what works, a lot of the time, in fact. There's a lot of passion involved in the work of ending homelessness, so it's understandable, and you need to meet people where they're at, So if you're impatient, and you should be impatient as well, it can sometimes be quite challenging. There can also be as much of a struggle to work out how on earth do you embed something once you know it actually does work. It's not automatic, believe it or not, and we don't give enough thought as to what type of resource might be needed after a trial is done. So a lot of challenges and a lot of thinking still to be done. But what that tells you, I guess, is that what you need more than anything in this work is grit. It is often said that ending homelessness isn't rocket science. I disagree. It's actually much harder. Getting a rocket to the moon may be a complicated problem, but it's not a complex one. Complex problems like homelessness and those addressed by other What Works centres are defined by the fact that an action in one part of the system can have unpredictable consequences in other parts, and no single intervention can solve it, ever. So looking ahead, I would like to offer just a few reflections. The What Works model should and must continue to evolve. Wherever in the globe you are, the root causes of homelessness and other social problems are the same. That's what the evidence tells you. And so are the patterns. People in poverty are disproportionately affected. So are people who are black and from an ethnic minority. So are people with disabilities. Strange as it may seem, improving the results in homelessness can only be achieved if pursued indirectly, alongside other social policy areas. In the end, our ambition in the What Works network can't just be to answer the immediate questions in front of us on a single social policy issue. We need to build, as a collective, a system of practice and learning that asks and answers even more specific questions across the entire system, as well as going back to deeper causes, and in so doing, change what we do to make the world, we live in a lot better. So that's what I've learned, and how can we put this learning into practice? As a collective, we should be focusing on building a movement, not just institutions. That's so important. We must continue to experiment, but different types of experiments, not just interventions. We must continue to challenge received wisdom, stay restless in our pursuit of knowledge, and crucially, stay true to the evidence. And that will be, I hope, the legacy of the What Works network in the future, as it was of the Enlightenment, before us, which again is another big inspiration of mine. That by doing that, that's how we make sure that we have the impact that the What Works network was designed to achieve in the first place. Thank you.
pleasure. I will now hand to Nancy Hay, Executive Director of the What Works Centre for Wellbeing.
Hi, it's great to be here actually. We're often the What Works Centre that's not really mentioned. We're not in the foreword, we're in chapter 14 right at the end. But we're a sort of quiet revolution. We get about 1,500 people a day, 25,000 people a month using the resources. That's just what we know of through the data. So it's clearly something's happening. I love that you started with where you came to this, and I came to this as a policy official going, how can I value the changes to the electoral system in my policy making? I can give you the costs, but I couldn't give you the benefits, and I can't value what matters. I can't value democracy. And I was like, how do you do that? And then I was also puzzled by, like, how do you make a good law? And it turns out to make a good law, you need a good policy. And I was like, well, how do you make good policy? So I went off to run the policy profession, and it turned out that making a good policy brings together the politics and the democracy, the evidence and the delivery. And what works is the evidence about delivery. And that's often what's missing. And if there's a lot of noise in the politics, it's almost certainly because there's not actually a lot of evidence around delivery. But how do you know if you've made a good policy? And it turns out you have made someone's life better. And how do you know whether you've done that? You ask, has your life better? And that's what we would call well-being. So that's what kind of took me to this series of questions, took me to this area where this evidence is just learning about what works and what delivery works, and particularly how we understand what makes the biggest difference to people's lives, which is the purpose of the whole of government, anything you do in the public sector, and actually anything you do in the voluntary and community sector, which is where actually largely we've been focused, particularly for the last 4 years. Wellbeing is this ultimate outcome and activity of these areas. We're a UK-wide, cross-sector What Works Centre. We work with government, public sector, all of its areas, national, devolved, local, parishes. We've worked with civil society in all its forms, whether that's somebody just deciding to set up a group in their area, which is what recently happened on loneliness. They saw a report on loneliness in London. Somebody set up a Lonely Girls Club for people who've moved to London in the last 5 years, which is when people are most lonely, and 30,000 people attended that thing. And that, I didn't do anything other than share that research. And business and employers in particularly as well. So we've been facing them. This is a task, given that we have not got a lot of money, that requires everybody to contribute. We're creating a learning system for well-being. So this is important because I was quite jealous of your 221 studies just on one topic on homelessness. We looked at what the evidence base was for sport and dance for young people. We found 8 studies. That is astonishing given how much money and effort goes into sport and dance for young people. We found 8 studies, most of which were not in the UK. So we need evidence. An evidence centre needs evidence, and particularly if you're going to get anywhere near cost evidence, you'd certainly need that. But also this involving everybody in that process is key to effective knowledge use. You need it to be credible and robust. You need it to be relevant and useful, and you need to communicate well. Those are 3 things you need for an effective knowledge broker organisation. Ashley Lenehan, your paper was fantastic for that. But we also have an evidence base of what works for research use. And it turns out that a lot of the things we thought work for research use don't work, or we don't really know if they do. And I thought we should build our centre on evidence. So we use 3 particular knowledge mechanisms. We use visibility. If no one actually knows about it, or can understand it, how can they use it? And it turns out Twitter's really good for that. So is LinkedIn these days, but also just generally just telling people about it in a language that they can understand in a professional way. And that translation bit is work. Capability building, mechanism 5. Learning is the only one that improves capability, so lots of learning. It turns out knowledge use, mostly learning, and capacity building, so building it into systems, getting those metrics in where you can really shift the dial. Can you get people to use the code in the way that they could use it? And that methodology, so you are credible and robust and rigorous. We have seen that evidence has improved. So if you go back over 5 years in some areas, we have got more evidence. It is more nuanced. It is more robust. And these are the sorts of things that you can see when you look back over 5 years. And we've had to build a field from scratch in some areas. And I have to mention Chris Whitty when he was Interim Chief Scientific Advisor for really helping me understand how you build a field, particularly when you haven't got any evidence. And that methodology is really important in that context. And we built in, from the start, public dialogues. We built in grey literature search, so evidence that's generated from non-academic sources, particularly third sector, who've done a brilliant job in stepping up to the game, business sector, who've been less good, which surprised me, at stepping up to the game, and also case study evidence and how you do that well, and qualitative evidence, if that's the best you can create from your project, how can you do it to the best quality so you can participate in that learning in a really good way. Which is a short way of saying one of the criticisms is that what works is all RCTs, and it's not just RCTs, but it is also RCTs. So how you get that nuance across, which people get quite angry about, is quite interesting. So my last 4 things, and in that very early stage, the zombie ideas that always turn up is because when people try things, they always look innovative, and actually the reason is, it's been tried, it didn't work, it was dropped quickly and quietly. Please tell us if something didn't work at that pilot stage and publish it. So that move towards a registry is great. So the last 4 things. The role takes time, and the role is not understood. So I really, that takes time point at the beginning. This is a bridge and a boundary organisation. We summarise, we hold that memory, particularly important as turnover is so high in so many areas. So that knowledge mobilisation, action 11 of the professionalisation of policy making. Translation is really important, and that boundary spanning both ways, bringing that practice-informed evidence has been really exciting. How can we get evidence that is useful to practice? It takes time to implement. So that's 17 years from evidence to practice on average. We've got something that we did in 2017 that only just got implemented in 2023, and that was a major achievement, and I feel really pleased. But the other thing is that learning takes time, probably about 3 years after the event. So we looked at places and spaces and social connection, and we had nothing yet from the pandemic, which we expect to happen over the next 3 years. The evidence will start to generate. So that 3 years after an event is probably pretty good going. And the last thing is knowledge use is learning. It's a process that is important. Engaging everybody all the way through is as important as the methodology you used. This is a system that everybody needs to be part of, so everybody needs to be understanding and respecting each other's roles, otherwise you don't get learning.
Thank you, Nancy. Now I turn to our last speaker, Jonathan Breckon, my good friend and co-editor, who I think is a visiting senior research fellow at King's and a couple of dozen other things. So, Jonathan.
Yes, there are a dozen things. I just want to make 6 points for what I think personally the future should be for the What Works Centres, and feel free to disagree in the discussion. But my 6 points is because I've worked directly for 6 What Works Centres, although one was only for 1 day, working on their board, and I didn't last very long. But generally, I feel one of the biggest fans, but I can see all the challenges as well. And I also want to thank Steen, who is my boss. I was very supportive of the What Works Centres when they can be quite awkward to set up. But my 6 points, very briefly. My first one is around collaboration. I think there's so much more we could do across the 13 centres. Every time I talk about the What Works Centres, I have to count them again. I'm never quite sure. I think we're on 13 if you include the affiliates and associates. We do work together very well when it happens. It's extraordinary. I don't know if you saw some work Michael did, analysing data for one of the What Works Centres and applying it in a different context. We try to set up a home for some of the What Works Centres just around the corner, the Evidence Quarter, which you're members of, to try and foster some of that collaboration. So let's bring more of that on board. The second thing is about the big cancer in our society, which is social inequality. There's so much more we could do on that. It's the elephant in the room so often. Now, we don't need a What Works Centre on that topic, unless you think so, but it cuts across so many areas, and it's usually systemic. So what do we do about that as our big challenge of the age? So inequality is a priority. The third thing is on innovation of methods, and we've heard about some of those methods. But if you talk to some people who've been around the block of this, some of the discussions about methods are too familiar. What else can we do around, I don't know, AI or different ways of doing automated synthesis of research? In other fields, like AI, the discussion on methods is out of date within a week, but we seem to be having the same debates that we had decades ago. So how can we pioneer some of the methods of synthesis, of experimentation, of evaluation? The fourth area that I would love to see even more work on, and I think it's one of the great strengths of the What Works centres, and that's the work with frontline professionals and practitioners. So often we talk about policy, quite rightly. Great to see the College of Policing here. The work with police officers, teachers, social workers, people who have a bit more devolved power, what used to be called street-level bureaucrats. How can we be their friend, really engaged with them and with others with lived experience of this issue? So professionals, I think, are crucial. The fifth area is on being more UK-wide. One of my failures is trying to get What Works Centre in Northern Ireland. We had a go. I think it was in Sinn Féin's manifesto, or maybe it was a Unionist party. Lots of appetite in Northern Ireland, and the Economic and Social Research Council were ready to fund it. We just couldn't get the ducks in a row and the government side to kind of co-fund it. But there's a gap there. There was a What Works Centre in Scotland, which is now gone. Wales has been extraordinarily successful. There was an evaluation of the Wales Centre for Public Policy, and it couldn't have been more flattering, partly because it's a kind of demand-led model that helps officials in the Welsh Government and ministers and SPADs. So more UK-wide is a fifth area that I'd love to see the future of the What Works centres. And then finally, I think, although I'm looking at the future, I think there's a lot to learn from the past. Some of you were here when there was the launch of the What Works centres 10 years ago at Nesta, where three of us worked. I think some of us have been in the building in Nesta. But actually before that 10 years ago, back into the days of New Labour, I see Dan Corrie's here. There's a lot to learn, and we have a book chapter that I wrote with Annette Boas, trying to say there's lessons learned for our centres from the past, let alone from other countries or the present. I do often feel there's a kind of Groundhog Day that some of the discussions haven't moved on. Like you mentioned, the RCT debate, it's like, let's move it on and be on the front foot and pioneering things. And some of that is about learning from the past. And that's why I think this book is so essential, is it could be a legacy for the future. I try to find out about the What Works for Children, which was with Bernardo's and I think the Economic and Social Research Council. I had a physical evaluation of it on my desk that somebody gave to me, and I lent it to somebody in the Research Council. It's gone. There is no legacy of that What Works Centre. It predated this What Works Centre. It had the label, but it was a different sort of beast. So capturing right now for the future 10 years, I think is a great value of this particular book. So those are my 6 areas: collaboration, obsess about inequality, innovation and methods, think about the front line, the practitioners, be more UK-wide and learn from the past. But just to finish off, I also got to use this opportunity to thank Michael, who had this enormous energy to make this book work, and without him it would never have happened. So thank you, Michael.
Okay, so you've now heard from our 4 excellent speakers and from one slightly rambling chair. We will now turn over microphones to you to ask difficult questions, or easy ones if you wouldn't mind. I will point at people. If I know your name, I'll probably say it. If I don't, I won't. And then if you could tell us who you are. So, Teresa Marteau. on the aisle. She's got black glasses and grey hair. Sorry. Somebody give her a microphone. Good.
Thank you. Good memory. Louise Martin, behavioural scientist. Thanks very much. I would like to ask the panel to reflect on future challenges, and we've heard some great ones. And I just wonder if what we need now is a what works centre for getting what works into policy. And I'm thinking about, I think it was possibly the first What Works Centre, which was nice, that was pulled into the family of What Works Centres right at the beginning, which was, still is, focused on health and in particular in prevention. So just to give two examples of policies government ambitions that are way off track at the moment. Halving childhood obesity by 2030, been a government ambition since 2018 and refreshed since then. Actually, we're on track to double childhood obesity by 2030, increasing healthy life expectancy by 5 years and narrowing the gap between the rich and the poor. The Health Foundation estimates that on current track that will be 192 years before we get there. And it's not that we have all the policies, but we probably have more evidence in that field than anywhere else. So the gap between the fantastic evidence that those on the panel and others in the room are generating and getting that into policy. Thanks.
Is the question, do we need a What Works Centre for policy? Okay, so everyone can answer that in one word. Yes or no.
So,
Or if you're a politician, maybe?
I mean, there's quite a couple of the evidence centres that are based on a what works for research use, research base, right? Which is what I talked about in the first place. But policies, decision, and I think that is a role that I thought that we've been able to learn much more about how you do that. But it's not evidence-based policy, it's evidence-informed policy, and I think that's quite important. And so that's one thing I would say, is that it's evidence-informed policy, not evidence-based policy. So it's not, my thing has made this happen, therefore that's the choice. It's a political decision in our democracy, so that's one thing. But I think there is a role for What Works centres to continue to generate evidence about what works for research use, and it is doing that. And I think that would be useful if that was more systematically done and actually more crucially funded, because that's about evaluating what we do. And I think we have evaluated individual projects, and I think there is a role for social research funders in particular to do that. And I would like to see more of that done.
Anybody else got any thoughts?
I mean, short answer, you pose an absolutely crucial question, and obviously there are lots of things where we do have an idea of what works, and for whatever reason we don't do it. So, I mean, it's the $64,000 question if we want to make research useful. I mean, the narrow question, do we need a centre for this? Good question. I mean, it's probably an art rather than a science, and when I see it working, it often works in kind of quite messy and sort of ways. When research does have an effect, it often has an effect in a way that we wouldn't predict or wouldn't want it to. But I agree that the broad idea of trying to develop this art or the science or whatever it is absolutely crucial.
But let's put it that way, if the existing What Works aren't doing that already, then they're being ineffective, because that's what work centres are meant to do. They're not just research institutions producing research. What makes What Work Centres is the focus on engagement with the user, whether they're in local areas and certainly in government at different levels as well. So that's the heart of the model, if you like.
So I guess I'll take the chair's prerogative and give my own answer, which is it's not super clear this needs to be a research centre. I feel like Britain has this wonderful tradition of talented generalists, and so we all think we can kind of do everything because we're kind of a bit clever. The act of persuading someone to do something and the art of designing or funding a randomized controlled trial are incredibly different skills, right? So Tim Loynig is here somewhere. He's the only person I can think of who's fantastic at making ministers do stuff, and also very, very good at econometrics. It's not a skill set that necessarily overlaps, which is why I don't do very much policy influencing. Similarly, when it comes to, for example, in my old role, influencing social workers to think about the way that they're practicing, you don't want me talking to them. You want Nimal, who I can see on the edge of the road there, who is a social worker who can talk about evidence. We tend to think, I'm really smart, I can do research, I can do everything. It reminds me of the bit in Black Books where Dylan Moran's character says, my oven can cook anything, my oven can cook bits of oven. And it's throwing the knobs in. I feel like we need to recognise that is both an art and a completely different skill set to that which most of us have. And we shouldn't look at the Tim Loynigs, the David Halpins of the world and say, look, they can do it, therefore surely all of us must be able to. Most of us are not built for that. Next question. Gentleman with, well, I'm going to say glasses. Unfortunately, this is quite a nerdy crowd, so it doesn't distinguish him. Sort of fourth row from the back. He seems like he's tall or he's got a cushion. That guy there.
Thank you. I'm quite tall. I've got two questions, if I may. I think I'll direct one to Jonathan and one to Nancy. And I'm Will Millard, by the way. I work for the policy consultancy SQW. To Jonathan, I'm interested to know what your sense is. Which are the areas of public policy that don't have a What Works Centre and need one? That's the first question. And the second question to Nancy. My background and specialism is in education, and I see the same sources from the Education Endowment Foundation quoted by people making completely opposite arguments. And I just wonder what your experience is, Nancy, of, I think it comes back to that translation point. How do you create the conditions where people can engage with research in good faith and accurately?
Jonathan and Nancy.
Yes, in terms of missing areas, well, there's quite a few, but what I would resist is thinking that every government department needs its sort of policy what works centre, because that just reflects the silos that we see in Whitehall and Westminster and other jurisdictions. One of the ones that's possibly missing, but I think possibly for quite interesting reasons, is on net zero and climate change. And there was a move by government to look on a What Works Centre for climate change, but the scoping for it basically found we don't really need to do what works. It's more about let's get on with it. Do we need more evidence about climate change, its impact? I mean, maybe it's more the behavioural science of things that we needed to intervene. So they decided not to fund it. But my key message is let's not reflect the silos of policy. And that's why I think something like well-being or homelessness is really interesting, because there's some cross-cutting issues there.
I disagree with you that we need to nudge our way out of climate change.
I agree too, yeah. Political economy, as Steven said, is probably the one.
I might answer that question as well. So wellbeing covers quite a lot of things that you probably don't think it does. And so we have national wellbeing, which covers an awful lot of things that help keep us well and help keep us thrive and how we measure it. It covers place and community, including social connection, cohesion, loneliness, and inequalities between places and inequalities more generally, and also working age, a large number of things. So it's almost certainly something that we cover, and we had a hub and spoke model that could work more effectively. So you have What Works programs rather than What Works centres, because there's another thing about where the life of this learning goes and stays as well. So that was the original conception of the What Works Centre for Wellbeing, which can kind of cover pretty much anything you like. The other bit to say is how do you create the conditions for a debate? And I think, I mean, a couple of things. People don't listen. If someone's passionate about what they care about, they're not going to go listen to you if you say it doesn't work. And also, people, actually in some ways I'd rather they were having an argument about the evidence than completely ignoring it. But that's quite useful conversation to be having. How do you create the conditions? So a learning conversation or a learning system has three things. It has mutual respect, mutual trust, and mutual freedom of expression. That's how you have a learning community, and that is quite hard to maintain, that trust and respect between different players. And the reason I winced when you said street level bureaucrats is, anyone proudly identified as a street level bureaucrat? I haven't. That's in itself as a term, and I think how you have those relationships of mutual trust and mutual respect, I think, is really important. One of the ones I would give an example is often people, I'm going to single out the health research sector here because they're very experienced in their research, got loads of it, and they'll often do a systematic review, oh, nothing works. don't fund it, particularly on loneliness. They're like, nothing works, don't fund it. We did the same review and oh gosh, this is interesting. We've not found many things that work. Why? What do you think about that? And that's a much more constructive conversation, as is, okay, you're going to be doing this thing anyway. How can we make the best impact from what you're doing anyway? And actually, through that conversation, like some of the charities we've worked with are phenomenal. The about turn they've done from their learning of, gosh, we thought it did this. Our theory of change was this. We've tested that. And actually, oh God, we need to move that. And that's the culture you need if you're going to learn from this stuff. And you need a learning culture that has those three things, which is pretty hard to do, but it's worth doing and possible. And I think professions are a large part of that, because it's about learning as part of that identity that you have and being good at your job.
Great. Jake Anders, who is that guy in the pink shirt.
Hello, thank you. Possibly slightly provocative question. For some people, when you mention what works, they immediately start blathering on, oh yeah, but that's not what we need. We need what works for whom, where, when, why, how. I'm sure you've all heard it. And when you sort of probe that a bit more, it often seems to come back to the association between what works and RCTs. With that in mind, do you think it was a mistake for the What Works movement to be so closely intertwined and identified with RCTs as a method per se?
No. If these arguments are largely self-serving, both mine saying we should do RCTs because I'm a trialist and that's what I get paid to do, but also people saying it's not, no, we need what works. We need what works who, where, well, whatever. So that what they're either saying is, don't do an RCT, do whatever my pet research method is. Or they're saying, I reject the finding of your RCT that says my thing didn't work, because actually we should have found the five people large subgroup for whom it did work, and then I should be able to continue doing my work as funded. I think my perspective is that if anything, we haven't been firm enough. I think a lot of What Works centres have spent large portions of the last 10 years bending over backwards to be nice to people who hate us, and these are not the people who matter. So there are social workers who hate me, there are teachers who hate me, there are all kinds of professions hate me. And judges. That... Sorry?
Judges.
Judges? Oh, fucking judges. There you go. Jonathan is recalling a particularly traumatic event. Moving on from which. So I no longer run a What Works centre, so I'm allowed to say things like, it doesn't matter if ethnographers don't like us. Right? What matters is if social workers who are out there doing a really hard job day after day feel as though they have good evidence that they can rely on to make decisions, that directors of children's services can make those decisions, that ministers can make those decisions, head teachers, police officers, whatever you're called if you run a police constabulary, chief constable, that it matters that the people who are actually doing real jobs, helping real people, feel like they have evidence that allows them to do their jobs well. That we can use the evidence for practice that works to go to Treasury or whomever and say, this thing works, this thing makes a measurable difference, it reduces crime, it improves the lives of young people, and so you should fund the crap out of it, Minister, respectfully.
Can I build on that?
Can I finish? That's the thing that matters. No, I've been up and down the country meeting teachers, social workers, everybody. Nobody has ever said, I'd like to talk to you about epistemology. That only happens inside these rather verified environments that we exist in, and I think we have spent too much time and too much energy trying to get people who hate us to like us, and they're not going to. Ligia.
People don't hate Michael, let's clear the record. But just to give a slightly different perspective, I agree with Michael, but the simple way of looking at this is the reason why there needs to be institutions that are really with a razor focus on RCTs is because that's where the weakness is in the evidence ecosystem. So in homelessness, we did 2 evidence and gap maps, for instance, to have a baseline when we started. We have a huge amount of qualitative evidence, lots of it crap as well, by the way, because we did the assessment. RCTs, very, very few. We had 11 when we started. Again, they're equally, the quality is exactly, so...
Long distance between those things being high quality experimental research, for example. And so I don't think we should just say, well, RCTs are crap, so we get it right. I mean, Michael knows I am a trialist as well.
So that's not what I'm saying. What
I
I'm
don't think Jake
saying,
hates
yeah. What I'm saying is, it's important that to have that, that focus, because there are no RCTs in certain areas. So in homelessness there weren't any at all. So that's why it's important. So let's not get into the detail of, oh my goodness, do people hate us or like us? I think it's really important to be able to focus on, if we don't have all the types of evidence that we need to explain something, that we need to do that. Otherwise we'll never be able to answer all the questions that need answering. And in relation to the other point, what we don't talk about at all is relationships. It's not, you need to understand what's useful. The most important thing you need to understand if you're going to translate anything is what's useful to you, because people do use evidence, but often they use it badly. They're asking the wrong questions. They are actually pre-selecting whatever evidence fits, their worldviews. So you need to be there for them. You need to be friends, for sure, not enemies. A trusted advisor to help people look at things differently and ask the right questions.
Thanks. Next question, lady in the second row, and then we'll go immediately afterwards to Rachel, who I think had her hand up and is right next to her. And then we'll go to the gentleman in, I'm going to call that like a maroon jacket? Yeah, cool. Hello.
Hi, I'm Megan Strug. I'm with What Works Centre for Local Economic Growth. Thank you very much for the shout out. So I focus my work on engaging those in local government, those who are actually trying to write bids and write strategy and talk to businesses and do just about everything because they're in smaller and smaller teams. And what I've found in trying to convince them to do an impact evaluation is they are nowhere near ready to do an RCT. Yeah. And so a lot of the stuff that we've been doing has actually been about laying those foundations, about how do you ask questions, or what are the questions you want to know the answers to. How much do you think we need that broader capacity building across professions in terms of critical thinking, asking questions, problem solving, in order to really make a difference in terms of using that evidence?
Nancy?
The short answer is yeah, we need it. And I'm talking from somewhere where we needed to build the infrastructure from the ground up. We also get people come to us and go, so what works for children's wellbeing then? And you're like, wow, that's a big question, and where do you start? But also explaining that if you're going to do a strategy and use wherever you are, like strategy, we're going to do all these things based on the What Works research. Like, if you come back to that strategy in 5 years' time, are you going to have anything new to say? And if you're going to have any news, you need to build it up. And often people say, oh, more research is needed. Well, what specifically is the next step? Do you need to get evidence, data? What's the next bit you need to do? So the more specific you can be about those, the matter. But that process is important. So and that's both important for the researchers and for the practitioners, and bringing them all into the thing, helping you get the right question. And almost certainly at the end of that process you go, God, I wish we'd asked a different question in the research. But at least you've learnt that as you've gone through. But it's a continual thing. But the future I would like to see, and I've wanted this for some time, is and I would say this having worked on skills policy, is I think you could usefully have some qualifications in this area that would work for policy officials or people who are doing evaluation or whatever. But also, just picking up your earlier question about RCTs, we want to get to a stage where we can say, how confident can we be in that evidence statement and know what that means? So that, oh yes, we've had a few small studies that maybe someone shouted loudly in the press about it, but it's a small study, or whether we actually know we have multiple big findings that we can be super confident in that one, and it's a big effect size, and we can legislate on that. And we just need that level of sophistication. But having worked on policy skills training, this is something that you need in all different areas. So yes is the short answer, but that's the longer version of why.
Okay, thank you. As we move to the next question, I will say that there is a razor-thin wedge in which people think that you can run a trial. It's like, it's too early to run a trial, we haven't done enough of the foundational work. It's like, oh, it's too embedded now, we know that it works, no trial. And so it's finding people in that perfect moment is impossible, and so some people are just going to have a trial rammed down their throat.
Hi, Matt Smith, the Centre for Entrepreneurs and Global Entrepreneurship Network. I want to pick up on Stian's point about adoption of findings by practitioners. And I'll give a brief example. I spent 2 years just pre-COVID with the Home Office and National Lottery running a pilot across 6 UK cities, testing different models of delivery for refugee entrepreneurship support. We commissioned Loughborough University to do an evaluation. We used both Bayes business evaluation framework and the Home Office indicators of integration. The ultimate report we tried to make as accessible as possible. It was 2-page exec summary, 6 pages slightly more detailed, 40 pages of very detailed stuff. But the feedback from practitioners and other business support organisations was, this is just too dense, it's too academic, we can't get our head around it. How do we translate what works to help those on the ground that really should be learning these lessons? As a bonus question, if I can, cheekily, the role of co-creation and how you engage stakeholders in the design of policy. It seems policy making is still too much of a black box, particularly at the national level. Thank you.
The second one didn't feel like a question.
How to get more co-creation
Okay.
into policy?
So one person each. Who wants you?
Shall I go for the first
you
one?
go the first one.
Short answer, make it cool. And what I mean by that, because this is probably not the natural kind of thing that we think of as being cool, I think it is interesting to look at the way evaluating, randomisation, knowing about evidence, being able to read papers has become high status in certain areas. I'm sure there are very divided views about effective altruism as a movement, but they were very good at creating cool vibes around certain aspects of evidence in their sectors. I think it's really interesting if we're thinking, say, about government and public policy. One thing that we've been thinking about at the Royal Statistical Society is how to create a bit of a movement among younger policy officials to think it's cool to read social science papers and to absorb those kind of things. And I think it's doable. I think this is the kind of thing where, you know, if with the right spirit, it's possible to build these kind of things and to make it work. Probably be even more helpful if we get a bit of support from the right politicians who care about this. But I think it's probably a bit of culture change, which comes back to what we've been talking about earlier.
I think it does go back to Teresa's point, or my response to Teresa's point, that people who are good at statistics and people who are good at cool may also not be the same people.
But you just have to do it, you know, it's that simple. And if people haven't done it before, they need to see you do it, and you do it with them. And you do it for as long as as it takes for them to start doing it on their own, and they need you less. But it's it's relationships, co-creation. We don't talk enough about that, and we don't talk enough about the other mechanisms that are needed for collaboration. Funding mechanisms at the moment across the network are one of the problems that will definitely contribute to the lack of progress in terms of the potential of the network, not just in the UK and internationally.
I'm conscious that we're now standing between you and canapés, so I'm going to take 2 more questions and then we will draw a line. John? And then the person behind the guy who I identified as being tall.
Hi, John Kay from the Education Endowment Foundation. So a big theme across the panel has been there's lots of things we know don't work when it comes to evidence dissemination. We know having a nice publication on a website might be a necessary but not sufficient condition. We know that holding a nice public lecture even won't change people's behaviours. What examples across your work centres do you have of things that you think might have worked when it comes to those more active evidence mobilisation strategies?
Okay. That's Leisha and Nancy.
Yeah. So what we've evaluated and what we think we know works, 2 different things. So we have evaluated, we learnt from an early intervention foundation programme, learning programme that we then implemented ourselves and evaluated, and that was very effective. So evidence use is mostly just learning, and learning is the only knowledge use mechanism that builds capability as well as opportunity and motivation. Motivation alone won't do it, which is why I don't think cool is the only thing. It needs to be easy, accessible, social and timely, so it needs to be there when people want it. Sorry?
I feel like I've heard that before.
But it works brilliantly in this context, as does the CMO one. The other thing where we have had quite a lot of impact is working with people designing grant funding strategies to help work out what to fund. That's working directly with them to help them design their strategy, working with doing briefs for grant funding officers. Works really well. People help make decisions, putting things in that people can then just drop into their application, whether that's a research application or a funding application. That's quite effective. So that makes it really easy. And also just pushing it out when people are ready for it. So there's some great dissemination work that happens as a result of the programme, but that knowledge tends to stay in that group of people. And then they say, but actually those people move. And you need it to push it back out again when people want it as well. So that's really effective too.
So again, a good example that speaks to co-production. One of the things that we felt was missing in the homelessness field was a clear definition of what ending homelessness actually means, because there's a commitment from the government, and in different forms across the UK, but it's never actually been defined. So when we first raised the question, is this something that you might be interested in? Because until you define something, you can't then measure it. When we first raised it, let's say that the response wasn't very favourable in terms of, this is definitely something that would happen. But instead of giving up or becoming annoyed or saying you're wrong, we just continued to plough at it, and eventually we found local areas who were very interested in piloting what the definition might look like and a set of indicators. A few months down the line, then the government realized quite how popular this might be with local areas and started seeing the potential benefits. And they came on board. And now this framework is being rolled out across the whole of England. It's very much helping to shift the focus of work towards prevention. So again, this is very much about what work centres having to really embrace that humble mindset of meeting people where they're at, trying to find champions wherever they are, and not letting the perfect be the enemy of the good.
And if I can build on that, I totally agree. What I would say, the times I've managed to successfully get messages from research through, it just requires about 10 times as much effort as you think it will. You need to start from the position that no one is listening and no one cares, which is true about everything in policy. It's nothing personal, just no one has the attention. You need to keep on saying it to, if you've spoken to 10 stakeholders, then you need to talk to 100. If you talk to 100, you need to talk to 1,000. And when you're totally sick of hearing the message, then people have maybe just about started to listen. I guess the really practical implication of that is if we're thinking about resource allocation for these things, it does mean that we probably need to allocate a lot more resources than any of us, who are people who care about knowledge and ideas, would think, to the kind of very nuts and bolts issues of communicating. And, it's quite unglamorous.
It's really cool.
Okay. The lady at the back who has our final question, and so hopefully it's a great one.
No pressure then. Thank you, Sarah Jane to UCL. I actually wanted to build on the discussion we've been having so far around what makes a good evidence base and on co-creation. So what are the panel's thoughts on the extent to which we need to expand and diversify the evidence base to take more account of lived experience? It's something Jonathan briefly mentioned, of practitioner experience. And assuming that you do agree with that to some extent, then what are the implications for co-creation of both knowledge production and knowledge use?
Nisha?
Again, you just do it. You need to bring people with you, and you need to have the voices of lived experience. It's not difficult. You have a responsibility to all your stakeholders. In our case, from the beginning, whether it was doing the evidence tools or anything, you just bring people with lived and life experiences. So at the moment, we have about 30% of people with lived experiences in the team. They're not doing lived experiences work. Some people want to do it, some people don't want to do it, and we respect that. If we have a systematic thematic reviews panel, again, there will be people from lived experiences. You just need to be methodical about doing it, and then you do it. And there's just one of the voices that needs to be included in the mix of experiences, and that's all. And if you're focused on that, everything else works well. And by the way, if you're going to do this type of work, you definitely need to do it well, and you need to pay people for their time as well. Because again, power dynamics get in the way a lot. And again, we often forget that the people that you would describe, most people would describe as lived experience, are service users as opposed to representatives of, you know, that particular experience. And it seems to be important to remember that, because, for instance, take homelessness. Most people self-exit homelessness. So people that you might engage in different ways are not representative of the entire homeless population. And again, it's such an important thing to remember. So do it, but keep a sense of perspective and pay people for their time.
Yeah, it's a great one. A really good question, and I totally agree about the payment and the genuine engagement with lived experience. You hear a lot about the tokenistic, and academics not quite getting it. But we've still got a big journey to go on that one. Your other part of the question about the dealing with the sort of the practitioner and the front line and the co-production. If Jonathan Shepherd was here, who is somebody else who is thanked in the book, and another one of those sort of benign ghosts in the room, because he's been one of the advocates and involved in what work centres such as the College of Policing and many others.
Very much alive, though.
Very much alive. It's a benign.
Not that sort of ghost.
Yes, but I can't get along. He's having a very enjoyable semi-retirement. But what he would say, and I agree with, is, you know, we probably look to health a bit too much in terms of application and research. I think we can learn from other disciplines so much more. But the clinical academic fellow type role, where you're a researcher and you're a practitioner, and that feels natural and not a tension. I've been interviewing teachers and police officers, for instance, who are just so inspiring. They are the cool ones. They're not cool actually, but they've definitely got a really inspiring sense that is the future, that they are happy to have those multiple roles. I think I'd love to see a lot more of that.
Great. That, I think, brings us to the end of our questions and answers. Thank you ever so much, everybody, for being here. I hope you stay for drinks and can-ups. Thank you, everybody who has contributed a chapter to the book. Many of you are in the room, and the book literally wouldn't exist without you, so thank you ever so much for that. And thank you to my fellow panelists for their excellent contributions. Thank you.